Hey folks, today's video is all about timber framing and a whole bunch of tools that you might not have seen before, so stick around and I will explain all. So this is a much requested video and I thought I'd kind of walk you through explaining all the tools that go into creating a building like this. Now, bit of a disclaimer, I'm self-taught, DIY, entry-level stuff, but it doesn't take too much thinking, just a lot of patience and time to get to this point. We've got a nice big building here which was the first timber frame of this sort of size that I've ever done. And I've just built up my tools to get to the point where it makes it a little bit easier. But that said, nearly all of this can be achieved with not much more than a hammer, a chisel and a handsaw. So first up, we need to talk about the process. The process is I ordered rough sawn beams to come in from the sawmill. This is Douglas fir, and I've done green oak in the past. When you timber frame, you use green wood usually, which means it's freshly cut, freshly sawn. Might have only been felled a matter of weeks or months beforehand, so it's not dry. It makes it easier to work, but you also need to think about how it's going to dry and twist and things like that after, but that's a separate issue. We're looking at tooling today. So first up, you can order your beams to be planed by the sawmill. They'll quite often have bigger machines or nice big handheld planers that they can do that for you, but you charge a premium. They charge a premium for that, and if you've got a lot to order, it doesn't really take much to work out that buying one is actually a little bit cheaper than getting it all planed up, albeit you've got to do it yourself. So this is a 180mm planer, and it's an amazing bit of kit for the money. It's made by Triton, and the only other comparable one of this size is Makita or Mafel, both of which are going to cost you possibly more than your timber. So that is £200 or £300 and a really handy bit of kit. So that's what I used to plane up all of these beams, and I did that first using sawhorses, which we'll come back to later on. Then at that point you need to mark up. Now marking up the timbers is a bit of an art in itself. You need to work out size of your mortises and tenons. And once you've done that, you need to mark up onto your timbers. Now, a couple of things I like to use. One, a traditional framing square like this. This is probably a bit big for what's needed, but it's handy. It's about 600mm, I think. And what this also benefits with is the fact that this is 2 inches in old money, and this is 1.5 inches. So if your tenons or your mortises are going to be 2 inch or 1.5 inches, which are very common, then you can use this either to mark on your timber, or also once you've cut your mortise and you've started kind of paring it away with a chisel, you can use this, just slide it into the mortise to check it's snug and it's fitting well. You can also, with a bit of plywood, make up a tenon checker, which is essentially a letterbox with the right size hole, and you can slide that over your tenon to make sure it's the right size. Another measuring tool is combination square, which is super handy if you're coming in the same from each side. You want to be able to just butt it up, mark on, and it is what it is, but you definitely need one of these. Sometimes just the steel rule on its own is helpful as well. So that is kind of the measuring and marking. The marking side of things as well, I use these for the last year or two, Pica pencils. This one has got a lead in it, and that's normally okay if it's dry-ish wood, but you can also get a crayon which is semi-permanent, so it doesn't wash off if you're working outside. Right, now we're on to the fun stuff. Now we've got to cut the wood down. So we've got our beams, they're planed and they're marked up. You might need to shorten them or start cutting your tenons. So to shorten them, to do big cuts, I use this saw. Again, an inexpensive saw, bearing in mind the size of it. It's not a very refined model of this. It's pretty antiquated actually, I think. It is the HS0600 Makita, but it's what will give you that 110 10, is it? I'm trying to think what the cut is. It's just over 100mm. So if you were doing anything with sleepers as well, oak sleepers or softwood sleepers, this will cut through in one hit. Albeit you might want to do it in 2 passes, but this will go all the way through. It's a very powerful machine, no riving knife. It's a little bit, you know, double-handed, hold on for dear life, but really, really useful. Otherwise, what happens is you cut with a regular size circular saw, and if you're using big beams, you'll have to come in from both sides. You'll end up with a strip in the middle you can't get to, and then you hand saw that, and you'll end up with a little bit of a bit you need to plane off each time, which just adds another bit of process to the whole story. But don't be put off if you want to, and you've got the time and a nice new saw or sharp saw. It's pretty easy to work with. Now there's a few different techniques for cutting the tenons. You'll see people using anything from hand saws to chainsaws. I prefer a circular saw or even the track saw set to the right depth and just do a series of kerf cuts. For that I use a mains powered, this is an old Makita, and I can cut several curves into it, and then I can use the hammer and chisel to knock those down. And then once I've done that, hopefully I'm being able to find all the footage to put over the top of me explaining what I'm doing. Once I've done that, I've got 2 options. One is I plane the surface down smooth. So you want to use a plane, a rebate plane, I think it's called, where the knife goes all the way to the edge of the plane. That means you can get right up to the shoulder of the tenon and get it nice and clean. Otherwise, this is a slick. It's actually a boat slick for people who work on boats. You can get them in a few different sizes, and I will link to all these tools below. This one's 3 inches, weighs a ton. So this is not to be hit with a mallet or a hammer. This is simply you're pairing off and cleaning up. So you become the plane, if that makes sense. But it's very, very efficient way of just kind of stripping back very, very kind of small wafers until all your kerf marks are gone and you've got a nice smooth flat surface. This is absolutely perfectly flat, so it's a good reference point. So that should get you to a point where you've got your tenons cut. You can check them for width, you can use that tenon checker, all that sort of stuff can be done with very little tools. So you can hand saw the shoulders, pair it back with a chisel, and you're pretty much up together. But it's the mortises which take a little bit more effort. Traditionally, you would bore it all out with, once you've marked up your mortise, you would bore it out with an auger bit. So you've got a series of holes in a kind of chain, and then you square it up with a chisel. Actually, when you have a decent bit in your drill, so I've used owl or beaver. It's an animal of some sort. They're really, really, fast cutting auger bits. They're quite stumpy and short, but they work really well. Anyway, so you can, like I say, drill all your holes and then square up. But then you get to a point where, okay, I need 100 mortises in the building. It might be easier to get a chain mortise. So that's what I did. I bought a used chain mortise, very specialist bit of kit in that you cannot use it for anything really, other than potentially gates, fences, something like that. It is a mini chainsaw, which is captive, and you plunge it in a series of motions to cut your mortise. So this one is a Makita. It cuts with the grain. Yep, cuts with the grain. The Festal, I think, and the Mafel, slightly different. They cut the other way, but basically it gives you a square hole, which is quite clever. You are always going to need to tidy up with a chisel anyway, so you want to cut it a little bit under with that. And my go-to chisel, all of my chisels are made by Robert Sorby, UK made, Sheffield jobbies. So my go-to one is this. The first ever one I bought, it's inch and a half. Yeah, inch and a half. So if you're using 5 or 6 inch beams, this is pretty much everything you need. This is going to be the width of your tenon. You can use it to check your tenon. You can even use it with a pencil to mark up on the timber, and it's wide enough that you can pare down and tidy things up. I made a little leather sleeve for it to keep it sharp. Oak, you tend to sharpen them slightly different in the honing angle. Just shout if I'm getting out of my depth, because I probably am. but it's a little bit different. You're normally 30 degrees, I think, with hardwoods, 25 with softwoods. Anyway, as long as it's sharp, that's what matters. Recently, I've bought the 1-inch. I bought the electricians who wired up in here. I bought them one of these each as a thank you gift. At the same time, I had it on this, and it's a 1-inch. Not used it yet, but it's going to be quite handy for some just getting into the corners. Maybe that I'm doing slightly different mortises, different sizes. So that's kind of those two. Sometimes I use a 2-inch, just normal bench chisel if needed, but normally between those I can do nearly everything. One thing I haven't mentioned is these braces, which I cut. Traditionally, if you're doing an oak frame, these you can get out really lovely ones out of a curved section of the tree. However, if you want that look, sometimes you need to cut this curve in. You obviously can't do that with a circular saw, so these I did actually do on the bandsaw just to give that, but it's really optional and you wouldn't need to do it. Also, once your frame is up or before construction, you can use the router just to put this chamfer. You might not be able to pick it up on the camera, but all of the edges here just have the corner taken off, which is just for aesthetics. Each section you do, it's quite good to mark on, and you can either mark with a pencil and hope it doesn't wear off, or go around and chisel it on. And you can either do that just with a regular chisel and do them straight. What I've done in this building is I use a straight chisel for, just with Roman numerals, straight chisel for all of these up top, and then the bottom of my frame I did with a gouge, so it's like a moon shape, and that just meant that it's a bit easier when I come to assemble. Now, one of the most important things which I haven't even mentioned is my sawhorses. So the sawhorses I've got are just made out of studwork, CLS, super cheap and simple, but very strong. What it gives us is a raised, easier height of working to either machine or also assemble. And it just means, if you're doing this traditionally, you would normally map out your frame over in a barn, even on sawhorses, and you would use plumb lines and all sorts to get all your joins right, because no timber is perfectly square. I've cheated in this situation. I've actually just gone off one reference face, and it's not cheating, it's just one technique. Anyway, I digress. Next thing we want to do is start assembling the timbers together. So hopefully we've tested them in the workshop or wherever we've made it to make sure our tenon and mortise fit. So you need to give them a bit of a wallop to get it in. We haven't talked about hammers or mallets. This is my go-to hammer now. It's Thor. Maybe I thought it's a raw hide mallet or hammer. Pretty weighty, and I think that's £3 for £3. But it works great with these ash handles on the chisels. And also, if you need to pound in the timber, it doesn't really cause too much damage. Now, I also, rest in peace, I have the Commander, the Persuader, and that was a big bodger. Essentially, imagine this, but this head was a big railway sweeper. Anyway, that is perfect at pounding in beams together. But if you're having to work that hard to put them together, they're probably too tight because you'll never get them apart again. We need to actually assemble and then take apart our joins one last time. So at the point of assembly, this is more about the tools than the how-to, but we've already drilled our hole. So the hole that's in the sides of the mortise that goes all the way through, it needs to be a set distance in from the edge. I think I did about 50 mil or something here. Probably no huge science to it, but as long as it's the same on all of them. Once that goes all the way through, you'll be able to actually look through the timber, and it will go through one side of the timber into the mortise and then through to the other side. We then want to push our tenon into that hole, and then we use this. Well, we don't have to use this. Sometimes in the past I've just used an auger bit, and if you imagine the auger the same size as the hole, as it goes through the center point of that auger at the end of the drill bit, we'll leave a little indent, and we can then take it apart and measure 3 millimeters back towards the shoulder of the beam, the post, sorry, and that will be where we drill our hole in the tenon. This does that same thing for us. It is an 18 millimeter piece of steel, and on the end it's got a tiny little pricker but it is offset. It's 3mm off center. So what I want to do is when I put this in, because of this flat ground bit on here, I know where the pricker is. So that's towards the cheek of my post, of my tenon. So I put that in the assembled joint, tap, pull it apart, and I'll be able to see where that point is. So I know that when I drill my tenon, it is offset by 3mm. So that's a handy bit of kit too. So that is a pricker. Finally, there is one more tool in the arsenal, which is a podger. So at that point, we've got our holes offset. We can assemble the joint, and we can take our oak pegs, which in this case we've used oak. So you really want to use a timber that's harder than the posts and beams. So these oak pegs are slightly pointed on the end. If needs be, you can plane or chisel them down just to a point. And you drive them through, so it's going through the first hole, and then that offset hole, it's kind of got to go down a little bit to pick up on it. But if you're just at the point where you're assembling the frame, you don't really want to be driving all these in, because if you need to do any adjustments, you'll never get them out again. So what you do is you use these, and these are called Podgers. These are stainless steel ones. If you were being crafty, then you would just make your own. I was lazy and I bought these, but these are made from stainless steel, which I couldn't weld anyway. But you can see that they're machined down slightly on this end, so they're kind of simulating one of those oak pegs, but they're also a T-shape. So one, you don't gouge your eye out when you're bending over, but equally you can hammer them up to get them out of the joint. So you might have a whole bunch of these. They're quite expensive. I've only got two, so I kind of swap them around. But if you've got these in position, just holding a brace in, once you're happy, then you knock this out and you can replace it with an oak peg. So that is a podger. So we've got a podger. A bodger is sometimes what the giant mallet is called. And we've got a pricker, which is this one. But anyway, that might be some in the West Country, but podgers and prickers all the way. Now there are other ways of cutting. We've gone into hand tools. That's an easy way of doing things. If you're on a commercial basis, they've probably got giant tenoning machines, which are basically like something out of kind of a robot movie. 3 or 4 circular saw blades which are cutting in, or giant knife blades, I guess, because it's a bit like a planer knife. You can get a handheld one. I think Mafeld makes one. All scary stuff, all scarily expensive, but with most of this is actually conventional DIY. If you've got a circular saw and you've got a plane, even if you just had a regular 2-inch or 1.5-inch bench chisel, a hammer, handsaw, ruler, there's no reason why you can't build something like this. It's just going to take a bit longer. So don't be put off by the tools. That's my go-to message for a lot of my projects. The tools just make it a little bit quicker and easier, but they're not a big enough hurdle to not being able to build the actual structure. So I've done timber framing in the past. My little oak bench, which I did 9-10 years ago, which was my first attempt at a mortise and tenon, I literally just did with a sharp, cheap DIY handsaw from B&Q and an auger bit. It was nice and accurate and calm and steady with my saw. Popped it together, and it's up on my deck now, and it's still there. So bizarrely, the entry level is low, but what the output is pretty fancy. You might find actually you need more startup tools to build something in stud work. You know, if you want to go out and buy an impact driver and a mitre saw and or a nail gun or something like that, whereas a hammer, chisel, saw, you can build almost anything. And then finally, timber choice. Well, I've only got experience with oak and Douglas fir. I really like oak. I think it's got a nice bit of character to it. It's not usually English, actually. Quite often it's European. But even so, it's strong, it's reliable, and you know it's going to last a long time. That said, don't knock Douglas fir. This is a slightly warmer hue because I've oiled it. You might not like that, so you can whitewash it. You can leave it natural and let it grey. It's not bad outside, but on an internal environment like this, where we've insulated outside of the building, no reason to not use it. It's grown locally. Most places in the UK have got forestry around them that you can source and know where it's coming from. These trees were just felled to order. You can get crazy lengths of it straight, and it's lighter. So in this instance, up here, I've got 300 by 125mm, which is 12 by 5 beam, and it runs a clear span of over 6 meters, or just under 6 meters. You'd be hard pushed to get that in oak, and if you did have it in oak, I wouldn't fancy lifting it alone. I did this with a little homemade crane thing. I managed to do it all on my own, with Joe kind of watching and screaming from a distance, but it was safely done, controlled, and it's amazing. I love this Douglas fir. It's got a lovely smell to it when you work it. There's no real negative. It's still got the tannins and stuff to worry about, so if you're using metal fixings on it, it's got to be stainless steel. But apart from that, oak pegs in the Douglas fir frame, I would not be worried about doing that again. Of course, you can use any wood, really. You know, throughout the States, I think they mainly frame in softwoods, anything from pine through to Douglas fir. In traditional UK frames, there's a right mix of hardwoods in those. The new farm has, I think, elm trusses in one of the barns. I'm not sure on that yet because it's whitewashed, but I'm pretty sure I've seen some elm-looking grain in there. So don't be, use what you've got. You want it to be durable if it's outside, but if it's inside, or if it's just a feature beam somewhere or around a fireplace or something like that, then just use what you got. And one more thing on timber is green is always easier to work. If you need to do repairs to a traditional frame and you are required to use dry or reclaimed timber, or maybe you've just got some reclaimed oak beams, do not expect it to be as easy as it might look in some of my videos. 200, 300, 400-year-old oak is not easy to work. It's not easy to drill. It's not easy to chisel. The chain mortar would have to be absolutely razor sharp. All of these things get so much harder, and you just need to go really slow and steady with that. Also, tools sitting on oak, sitting on Douglas fir, cedar will cause problems. And I've just realised that I didn't put my little EPDM pad up on top of the beam where this plane was sat, and it's been eaten. So I need to do a little bit of restoration to that. Anyway, I hope that gives you a bit of an insight into all these toys. They're all investments, and if you buy secondhand or you buy competitively priced and you do your project, you will not lose that much money, if at all. That Makita, I bought it after a chap used it for his project. I could sell that once I've done 4 or 5 projects with it. I could sell it and get all of my money back for a fact, if not make some. Circular saw, again, this is just a standard one. If it's green, a good enough blade in a cheap saw, you'll still be okay. Just make sure it's at a right angle. So make sure it's 90 to your plate, your base. This one, I guess, is a little bit more specialist if you want to go ahead and get a big one. But again, this is a entry or budget-ish level price point. So I would prioritize your chisels. Get really nice quality chisel and look after it. Make sure you've got something to put on the end. The ones that are supplied are pretty inexpensive, or just grab someone's handbag, a bit of leather, and just and make something to go on the end, and then you know it's going to stay sharp. Sharpening is a whole different story. I'm not going to go into that today, but I invested recently in the Pro Edge. It's a belt type sharpener, and that made things super easy, because otherwise if you're sharpening by hand, if you're like me, you get a bit lazy and you don't do it, and then you realise you've done 10 joins and you haven't sharpened it once, and then you sharpen and you're like, whoa, okay, I should have done that a long time ago. It improves the quality of the joinery. You're not, and probably is safer, because you're not wellying it or forcing the chisel too hard that you're going to slip and take your finger off. Now, like my disclaimer right at the beginning of the video, I am not a professional. I have no training in timber framing. I'm familiar with a lot of the techniques. I chat to a lot of timber framers, but that doesn't make me an authority on the subject. But this is just my haul, which I've got to the point where I feel like now I could build almost anything if I had the skills. It's just kind of understanding the basic principles and working up from there. If you want to see more of my timber framing videos, I will stick the whole playlist up here of all of the timber framing videos to date. And also, if you want to see the last video of raising this workshop frame, I will put that here. And thank you as always to these guys, all of our patrons who support the channel behind the scenes. Any questions, stick them down below. But that's it. Thanks for watching. Remember, if you can, do it yourself, and we'll see you next time.